Hello and welcome to week 2 in History of Psychology, where we're going to be taking on chapter 2, the philosophical groundings of psychology. Now, the history of psychology is clearly within the field of philosophy. So the early thinkers that we would say or accuse of thinking about what we now call psychology were the philosophers throughout the history. So science, even as it was looked at back then, was not as much applied to understanding human thinking. But there was a lot going on in terms of trying to understand how people think. People became aware, we evolved this brain, we became aware of ourselves, all this stuff. And probably the first thing we started thinking about was, who am I and why do I do what I want to do and what's my place in the universe? Those kinds of really, really big questions. So you're going to be introduced to a few of those right at the start that arise from the ancient world, but then people started writing about them in terms of this idea of the burgeoning, emerging world of psychology. Now, the first of these philosophies was mechanism. This comes from both a religious and scientific understanding of the things of the day. Religion, in many of its manifestations, projects the creation as something that has begun and it is following a plan. God created the universe, and the universe is progressing along its plan. When we look at things in the micro world, when human beings living in this universe look at the micro world, we see parts that work together. We see eyes and we see ears, and we see this both in the animal kingdom and in the human kingdom, and we also see it in the plant kingdom, and things are working. And then technology kicked in and we started building machines. And as I may introduce later, an interesting way in which philosophers think about who we are is to look at what we create, and in what way is that creation a reflection of who we are. So if we're creating machines, to what degree are we a machine? So mechanism really focused on breaking things down to each one of the parts. So lots of anatomy, lots of figuring out what the pieces of anatomy do. That was the early sciences. But then also determinism, meaning the creation was set like clockwork and things happen. The human will, although present, was nothing compared to the mechanism that was in place, that was just marking time. And the different religions would say your individual part of this is certainly important to you, but it's not going to affect the ultimate outcome. And that's been a philosophical question, whether we have free will or whether we're deterministic. That still remained with us, that question. We see in there a fascination with machines, and we're introduced to a person named Babbage. And I want to pull that person out of the content because that individual was one of the first individuals to start writing about machines that could possibly think. So Babbage is really one of the originators of the idea of artificial intelligence. Certainly back then, he was looking at mechanical machines. He built machines that did math. And in a way, they replicated the thinking processes of a mathematician. But it was that machinery. So he could build a machine that produced numbers, and he could look at the machine and wonder, how is that machine reflective of the actual brain processes that are going on? So that was this sort of loop between invention, the use of machines, and then a reflection on the philosophers is, how does that reflect who I am? So some really deep thinking about that. Then along comes Rene Descartes, probably one of the most influential Western thinkers in history, and he brought to light a number of different philosophies. But probably the one that he's most well associated with is empiricism, which essentially is the scientific method. We come to know things when we make direct observations of those things, and we conduct experiments about those things to get to know them. And that is all we know. The intuition, um, divine guidance, inspiration, those kinds of things are just bumps along the way. Ultimately, we only know things because we observe them and because we manipulate them through experiments. Now, we see children doing this. We're going to talk we talk in developmental psych about Piaget's initial stages of cognitive development. You have the little scientists who children's development coming to the point where they explore an object and they understand the physics of that object by experimenting with them. So if the child has a block and they have a ball, and they discover first that the ball's round, smooth, and whatnot, they start to define ball for themselves, and then they see that it bounces. It's one of the characteristics of a ball. It's almost guaranteed to give them another object, take a block, and along the curious sort of exploration of the nature of that block, kid might try to see if it bounces. They might see if the cats bounce. I mean, just those kinds of experimenting really reflect this idea, is that how do we come to know things? And it really is the only way that we know things. The next one that comes, let me cover this one because you actually have to write about it. He also separated. Now you look before, we have the machine, the mechanism of the entire body being the whole of creation. Then along comes Descartes, who says, no, the mind and the body are separate. We have been trying to put those two things back together ever since. Now, we have a class here at KVCC called Mind Body that is all about trying to make that connection much more true. But he introduced this, what we call dualism. Now, dualism has predominated Western thinking ever since it predominates even your thinking. When you think about yourself, you will often say, this is me and this is my body. Just even in the normal vernacular of our language, we had that dualism, me and this is my body. Like my body is a possession, but my thinking process, my me, my identity is somewhat separate from that. That's how deep that philosophy goes. So moving toward a more united way of understanding human beings, that's in the current field of psychology. Can we understand the connection between the body and the sense of self and consciousness? Next comes along a really important change in philosophy called positivism. Now, positivism was the notion that intelligent beings, as we were, human beings, could learn about things, they could study them, and they could build machines, and they can solve their own problems. Thus, the first of many schisms between what science can give us and what God gives us. So a philosophy that said asking God to intervene, I mean, even the modern people will say, that's fine. Ask God to intervene. In the meantime, start doing something about it. Make choices, build machines, problem solve. But positivism at the time came along and was really, really an important transformation in the empowerment of human beings to move their own history forward. This was put forth by a sociologist by the name of Auguste Comte. He was a great thinker in that he was very, very popular among the aristocracy of early America, where we had the steel barons and the oil barons, and that was the company that he kept. And he really emphasized this idea of personal talent, individual thinking, progressing the world forward. And we saw that in that age. He also was the individual, despite common error, who coined the term survival of the fittest. That was not Darwin. Survival of the fittest was coined by Auguste Comte, and it referred to societies which had the best skills, the best technology, and whatnot, were the most fit for survival. This created quite a negative view of native populations. Not that it wasn't there before, but this we're better than thou kind of thing. Pretty much the philosophy behind empiricism, which is when large, mostly Western societies take over less industrial but resource-filled environments and societies and countries and bring them into the fold. So empiricism comes from in not empiricism, imperialist. That's probably a better word. Imperialist philosophy to create the empire. So you see, it existed before, but certainly this is the philosophy that came out of it. But now we're looking, we can solve our own problems, and you can see how important that is in the modern world of psychology. And finally, we look at materialism. And materialism, as much as it's talking about, it seems like it's talking about stuff, it's actually a reaction to mechanism. So you have mechanism as all the parts. Materialism is what do those parts produce? That's more important. So you might have a machinery, but that machinery produces thoughts, memories, impressions, perceptions, feelings, those kinds of things. And that's the material. That's the outcome of the materialistic aspect of the mechanistic aspect of our bodies. Now, what we have from there, we have the work of John Locke, who introduced the idea that the mechanism, when it's born, is a blank slate. That's an important philosophical concept. Blank slate upon which experience writes. So we come into the world with nothing. We're just the mechanism. And that interacting with the environment then allows that mechanism to start producing ideas, thoughts, and whatnot. Now we know that blank slate philosophy is not necessarily completely true because we come with predispositions. We know that now. But this idea of the blank slate, of whatever experiences somebody has, we can shape individuals. That had a profound effect on parenting styles, on supervision styles. They go back to the positivism, how the steel and oil and transportation barons treated their employees, that kind of stuff. It was really shaping people in a way, kind of pre-behaviorism, which we'll get into a little bit later. There was also John Stuart Mill was famous for introducing the concept of creative synthesis. Is that we are exposed to things in the world, and the mechanism, the machinery, produces a synthesis of all that. This is so darn close to constructionism and constructivism, the current model of cognitive development. It's really cool to read this in the history of psychology, that this idea that we as individuals create our sense of the world through a synthesis of all this information is great. And let's give him a nod, because he was an extremely strong advocate for the equity between men and women. He felt that these were equal beings. He published about that, got in trouble with it. He was, all of that stuff. So he was quite ahead of his time in relation to that. So given all of that information, I'm asking you to think about, in the discussion, dualism today. What does that mean? What does it mean? This mind-brain, this mind-body thing. Mind-body, where is that? Where we hear about it all the time. We hear about mind-body, about being connected to your body. I mean, meditation and mindfulness and whatnot. All of that is an effort to reconnect that initial schism that happened between the mind and body. So let's reflect on that in the discussion, what that means to you. And then the quiz kind of going over all of these philosophies and just giving a paragraph on each one. So the first question, explain mechanism. I'm looking at the biology, basically biological psych. Explain that and how that's important for understanding human psychology. And then in the second question, we're going to take care of the others. Explain positivism, empiricism, and materialism, how they construct, how they produced, how they contributed, to the world of psychology. So these are brief answers. You don't have to wax philosophically here, but a little bit. But the first one, I'm focusing on the mechanism, which is kind of as much as the mind body thing is happening. The we're also learning about the biology of the brain a lot more. We're starting to go into places we've never known before and understanding, wow, there really is a lot of mechanistic aspects to the human experience. So those are the current hot fields within psychology, are looking at that mechanistic perspective of the machine of the brain, while at the same time trying to unite the body and the mind in the mind body dualism idea. So interesting history, considering that we're now come full circle. The current modern era is really looking at these two philosophies again. So that is this week. Have a great week. I'll be looking forward to seeing all your comments in the discussion board, and take care.